just like in the top of the first hour, we were joined by two guests. Well, here in the top of the second hour, I like to keep things pretty symmetrical. We are also joined by another two guests in studio with us. We have Jared Goerke. He is the Vice President of Young Democrats in Nassau. And then joining us over Zoom, we have from Florida, he's a professor at the University of Florida, Andrew Selepak, a media professor, here to give us some insight on some of the things we saw yesterday. And Jared, let's start here in studio quickly. I know you were at a watch party yesterday in Garden City. How did, what were the vibes like throughout, from start to finish, kind of when everyone started, going home?
It became pretty clear pretty early, unfortunately, that Donald Trump was going to return to the White House. But there was a sense of optimism in the room because, the first time I voted was 2016, the first time Trump won, and, we live to fight, right? We're not happy with it, and Trump is an excellent campaigner, and he brought what appears to be the House with him and the Senate with him, and now it's time to govern, which he hasn't really shown much grace and class to be able to handle that properly. And even locally, we had a nice boon. Laura Gillen is going to win. She declared victory last night. New York State Chairman Jay Jacobs declared victory as well. It may seem a little close right now, but it is a pretty insurmountable lead as the ballots get counted. So Laura Gillen will be going to Congress. And that's really on the backs of young Democrats who knocked thousands and thousands of doors across the 4th District in a close race that was watched across the country. And, Nassau is showing we're still on the map. Don't count us out yet.
Professor on Zoom, Professor Selepak, and any thoughts on any of the events that occurred last night?
I mean, I would say that, a lot of what occurred is what was expected in some circles. And the result, I think, probably took a little bit longer to announce and for people to kind of realize was occurring than was probably necessary.
And, another thing, just to stick with you, Professor, especially down there in Florida, what do you think were some of the driving factors that brought people out to the ballots? And maybe not necessarily in Florida because it was kind of, suspected and expected that the state would be red. But what about in those battleground states, which Trump essentially took a sweep of?
Well, if you actually look at what occurred in Florida, there was two pretty significant things. One was that there was an amendment that was proposed to make marijuana legal that failed. And, Florida is fairly unique at being, a state to have, legalized marijuana on the ballot and for it to fail, especially because there was a big push here in the state to do that. The second thing was if you start to look at the actual voting for Trump and the areas that Trump either overperformed in compared to 2016 or 2020 or won in this election, was that in South Florida, and in particular in South Florida, where the votes would have come from would have been a lot of the Hispanic voters and Jewish voters in South Florida. And that probably had obviously a significant impact in a state like Pennsylvania that has a high Jewish voters and actually a lot of Amish voters. But for the Hispanic voters, that would have also then had a big influence in some of the states that we started to see and will continue to see rolling out. So Trump probably has, we don't obviously know 100% because we don't know who was in the voting booth. We can't monitor, what every voter did, obviously. But, Trump overperformed from what was predicted when it came to Jewish voters and Hispanic voters, which was a big part of why he performed so well in so many different states last night.
Good morning, Jared, Professor Selepak. Thank you both for joining us. My question is geared very heavily in the direction of some of these swing states. As you noticed, Donald Trump essentially sweeped all of the important what's the word I'm looking for? Swing states in this year's election. What do you think Harris's campaign could have done differently in these battleground states, especially in the closing weeks of this election cycle, that could have given her some sort of edge in comparison to losing, wouldn't even say gracefully, to Donald Trump in these swing states?
Yeah, I mean, there were exit polls on TV yesterday that were showing that the majority of voters had made their mind up way before September. So, truthfully, with how big the margins are appearing to be in some of these swing states, I'm not sure she could have done much differently. There's going to be plenty of time for a post-mortem on this campaign. What went wrong? What were the issues? All of that. I think it's a little too early to determine what the deciding factors were. I imagine we're going to look at the economy. We're going to look at immigration. Roe v. Wade was going to be up there. I'm curious how many new voters voted for that. We saw a real record turnout in young voters in a lot of states. In Philadelphia yesterday, it was not enough for the vice president, but I think we're going to have more answers in the coming weeks as to what drove voters to the polls and why. And I think we have to move forward from that. But right now, I think it's a little too early to determine that.
Professor?
I would say that a big part of it is something that was kind of expected, and there's a growing gender gap when it comes to how people are voting. And then when you look at how Trump and Vance and Vivek have kind of, and Elon Musk in the past few weeks, have really spent a lot of time doing not traditional media interviews with sort of the legacy media, but instead doing interviews with everything from, both Trump and Vance appearing on the Joe Rogan podcast. Trump did, one with the WWE's The Undertaker, Andrew Schultz, Theo Vaughn, and really kind of going to younger male voters who, again, it could have been one of their first times voting. They may not have voted in 2020. And on the flip side, you had Harris, who, Joe Rogan endorsed Trump, in the very closing days, and she didn't do Rogan's podcast, refused to do 3 hours with him like he wanted Rogan to go to her. And I think it really missed out on seeing the importance of male voters, and particularly younger male voters, in this election. And the young male voters from every ethnicity, race, and so forth, but really kind of missed the opportunity to be in front of young male voters in the same way that Trump and Vance did.
Now, my next question is going to be for you, Jared. It's going to be geared specifically here to New York. On Long Island, especially when you were at the Democratic Watch Party at Garden City, what were the reactions to those local elections, not only just here in Nassau, Suffolk County, but also upstate New York in the House and the Senate? Was it a good reaction? Were there any surprises? What was the vibe like on that end?
I'm not sure there were many surprises, right? We had some great candidates in very tough districts that, unfortunately, with the trends in the district, they couldn't pull it off last night. And I give them all an absolute huge shout-out and an appreciation for taking the time to run in some of these districts that were really, really tough to start, and they ran great campaigns. Locally, we're sending Sheila Bynner to the state senate. She's a champion for public education. She's been a great Nassau County legislator, and now we're sending her to Albany. So that's great. And then you look upstate. John Mannion picked up a congressional seat, a state senator, and a champion for unions, for teachers. We got great elected officials on the Democratic side that were just elected in New York, and while it might not make the majority in the House, we kept the state Senate, kept the state Assembly, and, I think we're in a good place in New York, and we just got to keep fighting, right? You can't just give up after a presidential election. It's a tough morning, it was a tough night, but this is when you get even more engaged, this is when you get involved, and ensure that your values are represented, and you don't just let them win an election, that you hold their feet to the fire now.
And now, to go over to you, Professor, more of a national scale, I'd say, or an outside look from New York State. What would you say, key talking points from the elections in the House and the Senate were on a national level? Were there anything that was a shock, anything that didn't go the way some people may have thought it would have gone? And at the end of the day, do you think that this majority in favor of the Republicans in the House and Senate is basically going to give Donald Trump the ability to pass and do whatever he wants?
Well, you have something that was relatively unexpected. Not only did the Republicans keep the House, win the Senate, but you had Trump, who got the Electoral College, and there's a good chance of getting the popular vote as well. And that means it's an overall pretty big mandate for the Republicans on a national scale. Now, we still have a polarized Congress. We still have a Congress that has demonstrated they don't necessarily get a whole lot done. But on issues like immigration, you have President Trump, who can go in and, sign executive orders as he did in his first term, as Biden has done in this most recent and during his current term, that can have a tremendous impact on something like immigration. The economy, it's a little bit tougher as a president to have a tremendous impact on the economy itself, but instead he can have an impact on oil leases and where they can open up some of those areas that could lead to lower prices when it comes to energy costs. And energy, is everything. Energy is your food costs. Energy is housing costs. Energy is transportation costs. That can have an impact on the economy, but it still comes down to Congress. They have to pass, in terms of passing a budget. And from that perspective, he can have an impact on something like immigration, a slight impact on the economy. But, even with a Republican House and a Republican Senate, you still need them to pass legislation. And it'll really depend on their ability to do that moving forward.
Professor Selepak, thank you so much for joining us this morning. I know that we were discussing earlier about issues that are motivating people and things of that nature, and you were saying that the president really doesn't have much control over the economy. I remember, in fact, being in a political science here at Harvard University, and they're saying that's more Federal Reserve and things of that nature in regards to inflation and in regards to top issues. AP News, AP Votecasts, and all the 7 quote-unquote swing states in this election cycle, Arizona, Georgia, Michigan, North Carolina, Nevada, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin, the economy was deemed the top issue. Obviously, you heard both candidates talk about it. President-elect Trump really honed in on that all throughout the cycle. Why do you think voters have such on both ends of the spectrum, a misconception that there is a lot of presidential power when it comes to the economy? Is it because that's who the bully pulpit is? What do you think it is?
Well, part of it is exactly that. I mean, the buck stops somewhere, and that's going to be with the president. And I think that voters, for the first time in anyone's living memory, it's no one's alive from the last time we had somebody who won non-consecutive terms with Cleveland. But, voters had the unique opportunity to witness 8 years of the economy with Obama as president, 4 years with Trump, 4 years with Biden, and they could look at inflation now compared to the years when Trump was in office. They could look at take-home pay now compared to when Trump was in office, or for older voters, look back to when Obama was in office. And even if the president does have, minimal impact on the economy outside of, being able to have that bully pulpit, being able to do things when it comes to energy costs, and, obviously there's a lot of other things that can drive markets and drive the economy in terms of, interventions in other countries, some of these executive orders when it comes to, essentially printing money, some impact on things like that. But, they were able to look at the question that Trump frequently asked, which was, are you better now than you were 4 years ago? And from that perspective, the voters were able to tell inflation was less, gas prices were lower, the cost of everything was lower 4 years ago. So even if the president can't, wave a magic wand and change the economy and lower inflation all on their own, they were still able to see their bills, they were able to see their bank accounts, they were able to see the price at the pump now compared to 4 years ago. And I think from that perspective, it's kind of, for many voters, that was something that drove them not only to the polls, but once they got into the voting booth to make a decision.
Yeah, I agree with that 100%. And, unfortunately, because people think the president seems to have absolute power, they get blamed for a lot of stuff that they really have no control over. And you look globally, inflation's a problem around the globe. It's the recovery of COVID still in the economy. And, Trump did a very good job with the messaging of, are you better off today than you were 4 years ago? But I'd like to remind everybody, the prices of gas were so cheap because nobody was driving. They were all working from home. We're in the middle of a pandemic. And, it was a very different economy because of that once-in-a-generation event with that pandemic. I give a lot of credit to President Biden. I think he's done everything he possibly can, but a president can't fix an economic issue in the country most of the time, let alone a global economic issue. The fact of the matter is Trump is excellent at campaigning. He made a lot of great comments on the economy. Now it's his turn to prove it.
I'm going to ask you a follow-up with that, Jared. Why, because you were saying about President Biden did everything that he could, why do you think the Biden-Harris administration, you can attribute it to her campaign and her loss, why do you think that they couldn't get that message out? Where do you think they went wrong in messaging?
I don't know that there was a great way to get the message out. The problem is that Trump has shown consistently over the past 8 years that he has a following that will loudly support every single move he wants to make. And what I've always said, and many people have said, Democrats fall in love, Republicans fall in line. And there were a lot of Democrats that were not thrilled with Biden, and they didn't see the other side as big an issue. They wanted Biden out, and they didn't vote, or some of them voted for Trump. And it's a real concern. But, I'm not sure there is a winning of the messaging game with a candidate like Trump who seems to have tapped into something way bigger than himself or anybody else possibly could with his following.
Thank you.
Now, Professor Selepak, I want to ask you another question here. Now, obviously, that Trump is confirmed as a president-elect, and then, Jared, I'll let you have a few words on this as well. What is going to happen with Biden and his administration? What do you think they're going to attempt to do in these closing moments of his presidency before Trump does take office? And like you did mention before, Professor, maybe sign some of those executive orders that he's been adamant on, saying he was going to get some of this stuff done within the first week.
Well, I would just like to go back to something that was just said, that Republicans fall in love. You had an entire Republican, group that were never Trumpers who did not fall in love with Donald Trump. That was actually a big part of the past 3 elections, where you had a Dick Cheney, a Mitt Romney, a Liz Cheney, the entire Lincoln Project that did not fall in love with Donald Trump. You can go back to Mitt Romney when he ran for president. Republicans did not fall in love with Mitt Romney. Republicans rarely fall in love with their candidates. They just vote for the person that has been nominated. Whereas you want to talk about fall in line, you had a candidate who I think one of the reasons why she underperformed was, when she actually had an opportunity to run for president for the 2020 election, dropped out before the primary because she had that little support, and she became the candidate this time because it was the party that basically said, this is our nominee, now go vote. So I disagree with this idea that it was, who falls in line and who falls in love. And again, you can see this from, so many different people over the past 8 years. But in terms of Biden's last few months in office, Biden very much having been in D.C. for the past 50 years is, from first getting elected, going back to when he first ran for president decades ago, has always been concerned about his legacy. And that's going to be a big part, I think, of what he's going to try to attempt to do with executive orders over these last few months while still in office. Also can probably expect all presidents near the end of their term start handing out presidential pardons. We'll see where those go as well. But I think for the most part, you have a president who has tried executive orders. A lot of them, especially when it comes to student debt relief, have been basically blocked or overturned by the courts. So in terms of what's left for him to do, obviously, again, wanting to protect his legacy, wanting to have a legacy in terms of something to kind of highlight. There are things that he'll attempt to do, but we've seen over the past couple months, really haven't seen much from Biden in terms of public appearances, media interviews, public speeches. So we'll have to see how this will change in these last few months compared to what we've seen, since he basically dropped out of the race.
Yeah, I think Biden is going to do something major that is not about policy, not about the issues. And it's that he's going to peacefully transfer power. I don't know a single Democrat looking at going down to D.C. on January 6th. We're accepting the results of this election. We might not be happy about them, but I guarantee on January 20th, Joe Biden's going to stand next to Donald Trump and watch him get sworn in as president, something that 4 years ago Donald Trump did not do. And we're going to show that, our norms are still there. It might seem like they are challenged, and 4 years ago they definitely were, but I think that Biden's legacy is going to be showing that a peaceful transition of power can still work, because we all thought Donald Trump was a dangerous candidate for president, and I still think he's going to be a dangerous president, but at the end of the day, he won a free and fair election, democracy at its finest, people got out and voted, and we have to accept the results, and we don't have to agree with him. We can fight him at every turn in Congress and pushing our members of Congress to fight his legislation, but at the end of the day, these people won. It was a free and fair election, and we have a peaceful transfer of power in this country, and Biden's going to show that that's still there.
And I like the point you just mentioned there, Jared, because it's something that is important. Is we've seen just there's always conspiracy theories around elections, but I think the consensus for this election is everyone's accepting what has happened, and that sets a good precedent for moving into the future. But I want to thank Professor Selepak and you, Jared Goerke, for joining us here on the Morning Wake Up Call, on the Wednesday edition of the Morning Wake Up Call. I want both of you guys to have a great rest of your day as well as rest of your week. As for us here on 88.7 FM, we're going to play some Fast Car by Luke Combs, and then when we come back, we're going to get right back into it. Stay tuned. 88.7 WRHU.